Okay, here's a question for you. Have you ever wondered if all the political infighting here in the US is it actually maybe our biggest vulnerability when it comes to dealing with other countries? Today, we're going to take a deep dive into exactly that. We'll explore how some pretty surprising shifts in U.S. foreign policy might not just be isolated incidents. Yeah, they could be symptoms of these deeper forces shaping global power rivalries. And our insights, well, they come from a mix of places, online political discussion, some really rigorous research from the Rand Corporation, and a fascinating new book on U.S. grand strategy. So our mission here is to help you connect the dots, understand why these changes seem to be happening, what they really mean for America's role in the world, and how, history and economics kind of feed into today's headlines. We'll try to do it without drowning you in information. All right, so let's dive right in. Our sources, they kick off with this really striking observation. It's about this like almost 180-degree turn some well-known Republican figures, think Lindsey Graham, Mike Johnson, Marco Rubio, seem to have made on supporting Ukraine, a real shift from where they were before. So you might be asking, what's really driving that? Is it like a genuine change of heart, or is there something more strategic going on?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right.
And our sources, especially looking at those online discussions, they offer a whole range of perceptions trying to explain this. It's definitely not simple. A lot of the talk suggests these Republicans are, well, frankly, terrified of standing up to Trump, as one source put it. There's this fear of committing electoral suicide.
Electoral suicide, so basically losing their next election if they don't toe the line.
Exactly. Some commentators even use pretty harsh language, like describing them as sycophantic weasels, or saying it's like classic mob tactics, where Trump threatens the Arno label, Republican in name only, just to keep them in line, keep their positions in power. It really comes down to this perceived need for political survival within the party.
Okay, so that's one powerful dynamic, internal party pressure.
Definitely. But the sources also mentioned other claims, ones pointing towards maybe more direct foreign influence. Now, these are allegations floating around in some online spaces. Things like supposed past financial dealings, talk of unverified intelligence files, even concerns about who was in the room during high-level meetings, like were American translators present in meetings with Putin.
Wow. Okay, so those are some pretty serious claims being discussed, trying to explain these policy shifts.
They are. But then again, other viewpoints suggest maybe it's more of a calculated, pragmatic thing. Some see figures like Graham and Rubio as having, quote, functioning intelligence. The idea being maybe they privately do support Ukraine, but feel they need to publicly kiss the ring, so to speak, just to stay politically relevant right now.
Ah, so maybe not a real change in belief, but a political calculation.
That's another interpretation presented. And tied into that, you also hear sentiment about the cost. People questioning the aid, calling it robbing the American taxpayer, or even just the grift. And one more angle mentioned is this idea of maybe underestimating foreign influence, but this time through social media, like failure to predict the power of concentrated foreign influence, possibly even involving figures like Elon Musk shaping the conversation.
Right. So it sounds like some sources are saying this isn't necessarily a policy rethink for everyone, but maybe just a really shrewd political move to stay afloat within their own party structure. That's quite a distinction. And these internal dynamics, they aren't just, inside baseball. Our sources suggest they have huge potential consequences, maybe even sabotaging American global power and influence, or possibly eroding our economy and political legitimacy. But to really get a handle on that, we probably need to zoom out, right? Look at the bigger picture of these great power rivalries. What can an institution like Rand tell us about that?
Exactly. These shifts don't happen in a vacuum. They fit into these bigger, longer-term patterns. And Rand, yeah, they've done some deep analysis on this. Their assessment, specifically looking at the U.S.-Russia rivalry from 1991 up to 2019, it reaches what they call a disturbing conclusion.
Disturbing how?
That the rivalry is actively pushing toward destabilization. And what's really interesting is how many of the reasons are about perceptions and like a breakdown in understanding, not just military hardware.
So it's not just about who has more tanks or missiles.
Not entirely, no. It shows how much rivalry depends on how each side reads the other's intentions, whether they see the other government as legitimate, that kind of thing. Rand points to 5 main drivers pushing things towards instability. First is military capabilities. Russia sees certain U.S. moves, especially things like ballistic missile defense, as an existential threat, like threatening their fundamental security.
Okay, so how we deploy our military matters a lot in their perception.
Immensely. Second, military restraint, or rather, the lack of it. Both sides seem less restrained, but Rand notes Russia showing a greater willingness to use force regionally and also to deploy its cyber weapons. Third, the acceptance of legitimacy. The U.S. has at times openly questioned the legitimacy of the Russian government, even calling for undermining stability there. That's obviously not going to sit well.
Understandable. What else?
Fourth, competition on peripheral issues. The rivalry isn't just head-to-head, it's playing out intensely in places like post-Soviet Eurasia, areas Moscow considers absolutely vital to its interests, not just some sideshow.
Right, their backyards, so to speak.
Precisely. And finally, number 5 is the norms and rules. There's been real erosion of written and unwritten norms. Think about the collapse of arms control treaties, plus a failure to create new rules for new domains like cyber and space.
So the guardrails are kind of coming off?
That's a good way to put it. And when those norms erode and perceptions get more hostile, the whole system becomes less stable.
So, okay, if this rivalry is trending towards being unstable, how does that actually impact us, you, the listener? I mean, why should someone care about eroding norms between Washington and Moscow?
Well, it matters hugely. When relations between major powers get shaky and unpredictable, you see ripple effects everywhere. Global markets get nervous, energy prices might fluctuate, international cooperation on big problems gets harder. It creates uncertainty that affects everyday life.
Okay, so stability is pretty important. What did a stable rivalry look like? You mentioned the Cold War earlier.
Right, the Cold War. From about 1947 to 1989. Now, it's incredibly tense, obviously, but Rand describes it as stable overall. And that stability came largely from both sides sticking to certain game-stabilizing rules.
Rules? Like what?
A huge factor was deterrence and trust, paradoxical as that sounds. By the 1970s, you had mutually assured destruction, or MAD. Both sides had tens of thousands of warheads.
Tens of thousands.
Wow. Yeah, staggering numbers. But it meant nuclear war was seen as unlikely, because even if one side attacked first, the other could still launch a devastating counterattack. Nobody wins.
So the sheer destructive power created a kind of stability.
In a grim way, yes. Then you had communication channels, things like the famous hotline for direct talks, and arms control deals like SALT-I and the INF Treaty. These were crucial for managing tensions, making sure misunderstandings didn't spiral out of control.
Keeping the lines open, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And finally, transparency. Things like spy satellites actually helped. They increased knowledge of the other's forces and movements, which reduced the fear of a surprise attack. Knowing what the other side was up to, even if you didn't like it, was stabilizing.
Okay, that makes sense. What about the U.S.-China relationship? RN looked at that too, right?
They did, from 1996 to 2019. And their take is that it's been mostly stable, but recently trending toward instability.
Trending towards instability. Why?
Well, a big stabilizing factor has been economic interdependence. You know, the idea of mutually assured economic destruction. Both economies are so intertwined that a major conflict would be catastrophic for both. That's a powerful deterrent.
Like a financial maybe?
Kind of, yeah. But lately, things are getting shakier. There's rising perceived revisionism, like the U.S. officially calling China a revisionist great power, meaning they think China wants to upend the current world order. Plus, you have these heightened threat perceptions around cyber attacks, space capabilities, and influence operations. So the trust is eroding there, too.
And China's military nuclear weapons.
Their nuclear arsenal is much smaller than the U.S. Rand estimates maybe a 13-to-1 ratio. But it's still considered sufficient for traditional deterrence, enough to make anyone think twice about a direct attack.
Okay, so we have these complex rivalries, trends towards instability. Is there a proposed way forward? You mentioned a book on grand strategy.
Yes, Michael O'Hanlon's work. He proposes a strategy he calls resolute restraint. It's an attempt to find a balance for navigating these tricky times.
Resolute restraint. What does that mean in practice?
It has two main parts. First, resolve. That means a really firm commitment to defend core U.S. interests and allies, their territories, people, economies, and keeping the seas and skies open for trade and travel. Basically, holding the line on what's essential.
So, strong defense of existing commitments.
Right. But the second part is restraint. This means being cautious about things like further expanding alliances, being quick to jump into military conflicts, or always pushing for the absolute maximum outcome in tough diplomatic situations.
So it's about picking your battles, maybe, knowing when not to push too hard.
Exactly. Strength, but also prudence. And he applies this directly to the NATO and Ukraine situation.
So?
Well, O'Hanlon argues that promising Ukraine eventual NATO membership is, in his words, a bridge too far. He points out that militarily, getting enough forces there to defend it would be daunting, and strategically, it just seems too distant, from core NATO territory.
So not because Russia objects, but because of the practical challenges.
He explicitly says Russia deserves no veto over Ukraine's choices. But he argues that pushing NATO expansion right up to Russia's border would still provoke Moscow severely, regardless of the justification. So his recommendation from this viewpoint is basically keep NATO as it is for now.
Interesting. It sounds like a pragmatic, maybe even cautious approach, resolute restraint. But couldn't that restraint be seen as weakness? Maybe encouraging rivals to push harder?
That's always the balancing act with any strategy, isn't it? Finding that line between being firm and being provocative.
And you mentioned this affects our wallets, too. How does economics fit into this resolute restraint idea?
Yes. A really key part of O'Hanlon's argument is using economic statecraft much more strategically. Basically, using financial and trade tools as primary instruments of power, sometimes instead of military force.
Like the sanctions against Russia?
Precisely. The sources point out those sanctions have hurt the country's economy, and apparently Putin's popularity has suffered considerably as a result. They show these tools have real bite, and the analysis suggests Europe, despite the costs of weaning itself off Russian energy, is actually much better positioned to weather such economic warfare than Russia is.
Even though it costs Europe money.
Yeah. The estimate mentioned is maybe several tens of billions of dollars a year in additional costs for Europe. But O'Hanlon argues that's a bargain compared to the potential tens of trillions of dollars or more that a major war could cost.
Tens of trillions. Okay, that puts it in perspective.
Right. So the idea is to get smarter about using economic power. He even suggests embedding economics experts within warfighting commands so that sanctions and military planning are tightly integrated, treated as equally vital tools.
So less military intervention, perhaps more economic pressure used strategically.
That seems to be a core part of it. It reflects a reality check, too. The forces suggest that launching big military campaigns to defend certain places, maybe like the Baltics or Taiwan, is just unlikely to succeed today without risking all-out escalation.
Why unlikely?
Because of how military technology has advanced precision strikes, cyber capabilities, and because competitors like China are much more powerful now. The risks of direct conflict are enormous. So restraint becomes more strategically necessary.
Okay, so resolute restraint involves military strength, economic leverage, and careful choices about when and where to engage.
That's the gist.
Yeah.
And O'Hanlon also argues we need to broaden our whole idea of what constitutes a major threat.
Broaden it how? Beyond countries like Russia and China.
Exactly. The Pentagon often talks about the 4+1 threats.
Yeah.
Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, plus transnational terrorism. O'Hanlon says, yes, those are real, but there's a second 4+1 list that's just as critical.
A second list? What's on that one?
Biological threats like pandemics. Nuclear threats, not just from states, but proliferation or accidents. Climate change. Digital or cyber threats. And finally, critical domestic and economic weaknesses right here at home.
Wow. So things like pandemics and climate change are being put on par with military rivals?
His argument is that they absolutely should be because they pose fundamental risks to national security and well-being. And what's crucial is how interconnected these all are.
Interconnected. How do things like climate and cyber relate to, say, Russia?
Well, take the digital cyber piece.
Yeah.
Our sources are blunt. U.S. national infrastructure is inherently vulnerable. Think about the power grid, finance, communications. It's all connected, often running on flawed software with weak security.
So an adversary could wreak havoc without firing a shot.
The assessment is that in a major conflict, an adversary would be likely to roll the dice with large-scale cyber attacks, precisely because of that vulnerability. It could cripple the country.
Okay, that's scary. And the domestic threats?
Yeah, the domestic economic side. The sources point to issues like automation potentially hurting the working and middle classes, America underinvesting in its children, the American dream being in trouble, plus serious fiscal woes, national debt deficits. These aren't just social issues, they're seen as national security challenges because they weaken the country from within.
So a strong nation abroad requires a strong foundation at home.
That's the core message. And the crucial point O'Hanlon makes is that these added threats, climate, cyber, domestic issues, they do not now outrank, supersede, or diminish the others, like Russia or China.
They don't replace them?
No. Instead, they're likely to exacerbate and intensify them. Imagine a major climate disaster hitting while geopolitical tensions are high, or a cyber attack during an economic downturn. These problems compound each other. So sustaining global leadership really demands tending to that internal foundation just as much as projecting power externally.
Right. So we've covered quite a bit today. From those specific policy shifts on Ukraine, connecting them to broader theories about political survival and influence, to Rand's analysis of why U.S.-Russia relations feel so unstable, looking back at Cold War stability for contrast. Then exploring O'Hanlon's idea of resolute restraint, using economic tools alongside military caution, and finally, broadening our view to include those other massive threats like cyber vulnerabilities and domestic weaknesses.
It really paints a picture of a world where neat lines between foreign and domestic policy, or between military and non-military threats, are blurring.
Definitely. It seems the central question we started with, whether domestic fractures are a key global vulnerability, is something these sources strongly suggest we need to grapple with.
So maybe here's a final thought to leave you with. If maintaining unity at home, fixing our infrastructure, securing our digital lives, if those things are becoming just as vital for global stability as having aircraft carriers, what does that mean for where we should focus our national energy and resources in the decades ahead? What does true strength look like now?
That's a powerful question. We hope this deep dive has given you some new perspectives to consider on how all these complex factors, politics, economics, history, technology, are interconnected and shaping not just America's place in the world, but potentially your future right here.